one thing that comes up over and over again, specifically when I work with the male members, is this idea of masculinity. And what I've found is that there is this fear that you can't be masculine in the modern age. The problem is that there is a very skewed view of what masculinity is and how it applies to relationships, especially when it comes to repairing a relationship. So in this video, I want to break down masculinity, understanding the nuance of what masculinity means and how to use masculinity effectively within your relationship. So before I begin, a lot of this video is going to be based around male and female relationships. Obviously, this is not exclusive to that, but I'm just trying to simplify it a little bit so that this video isn't 20 hours long. There's a lot of things that guys get wrong when it comes to masculinity. When people hear the word masculinity, oftentimes they picture toughness, dominance, control, zero emotion. And that is not by accident. It's actually very common to have this image. This is what culture, media, and often childhood teaches boys. Be strong, don't cry, don't be soft, win, handle it alone. And while all those traits aren't necessarily bad, there's a big catch. When they're the only traits that are allowed, things go really sideways, especially when it comes to relationships. So what goes wrong? Oftentimes there's this mask of masculinity. A lot of boys grow up believing that their worth is tied to how much they win or dominate, how little they feel, how many women they get, how well they hide weakness. And if you're a fellow ADHDer, you may understand this idea of masking who you truly are inside and how much damage it causes. Behind this masculinity mask is stress, self-doubt, loneliness, and shame. But oftentimes this mask says, I'm fine, I'm doing great, things are perfect. This mask of masculinity ends up leading to suppressed emotions, fear of vulnerability, strained relationships, explosive anger, depression, anxiety, and in worst case scenarios, violence or emotional shutdown. And ultimately, this is what we end up talking about when it comes to toxic masculinity. Now, a lot of guys specifically get offended when we hear this term toxic masculinity thrown around, because a lot of people take it as, well, people are calling masculinity toxic, and that's not fair. And you're right. If you take it that way, that people are calling masculinity toxic, then yeah, that isn't fair, because that's not necessarily true. Toxic masculinity, specifically though, isn't saying masculinity is bad. It's a pattern where emotions are mocked or bottled up. Control and dominance are used to feel powerful. Women, queer people, or beta males, weaker men, whatever you want to call it, soft boys, are often disrespected, looked down on, or dehumanized. With toxic masculinity, men are punished for showing care, showing vulnerability, or emotional honesty. So when we talk about toxic masculinity, this extreme version of masculinity is toxic because it hurts everyone, including men themselves. The thing is with toxic masculinity is that it is an extreme version of the core values of masculinity. Masculinity is about ultimately masculine traits, and this is not exclusive to men, but masculine traits are something that everyone will have in small or large portions. And masculine traits, masculine actions, are often things such as overcoming challenges practically, being assertive, logical reasoning. So the core of masculinity is not toxic. It is practical in certain situations. The problem is that so many men tie this idea of masculinity to their identity. So when they hear about this toxic masculinity, they think, well, I'm not allowed to be a man. They think that people are attacking men. But this idea of toxic masculinity is this idea that extreme versions of these masculine traits and actions and characteristics, extreme versions of them, are very harmful. And this also applies to the other end of the spectrum as well. Any very, very extreme version of something is oftentimes very, very harmful. And people get caught up in this terminology when they say, well, why isn't there toxic femininity, for example? The thing is, there is. The problem is that with masculine traits, it can become very, very easy to spot it. It's very obvious to spot for a lot of people. That leaves the question, how do we practice positive masculinity? How can we use masculinity in its most effective form without it becoming overly dominant within ourselves, especially as guys? The first thing that we can do is practice action empathy. I speak with a lot of guys who are under the impression that empathy is a weakness, that having an emotional side leaves you in a very weak position, because emotions get in the way of practicality. Emotions get in the way of winning, of conquering, of making money. The problem is, whether you acknowledge them or not, we all have emotions. If you want to be able to embrace your masculine traits, you are in a stronger position if you understand your emotions, if you understand other people's emotions. This empathy actually leaves you in a more powerful position. So this is a very masculine way to use a feminine trait. Empathy is not just understanding feelings. This is about taking action based on them. And this really matters because as men, oftentimes we're taught to ignore emotions or brush them off. Empathy is a muscle that you can build through practice. And this is actually a very masculine thing to do. Being able to develop this muscle of empathy leaves you in a stronger position, leaves you being able to manage your emotions more effectively and be able to understand others' emotions, especially in a relationship or trying to repair a relationship, being able to understand others' emotions and be able to come up with a much more practical solution, this solution-based side of masculinity, being able to come up with a much more practical solution based on everything, not just practicality or logic. And you can build this quite easily. Asking yourself in difficult situations with other people, asking yourself, if this were me, what would I want someone to do? Positive masculinity is being able to speak up or offer support when someone's hurt, even if it doesn't affect you directly. Being able to use reflective listening. You know, it sounds like you're feeling X, Y, Z, A, B, C. This is using your masculine assertion, your assertiveness on feminine topics. This is still masculinity, but it's using masculinity in a much more nuanced way. The second way to practice positive masculinity is to build a healthy self-reliance. But the crucial thing with this is that this is not isolation. You know, a lot of guys get into this idea of this lone wolf illusion, this isolated guy that hides himself away from the world, reclusive, thinking that this is powerful. But the truth is that real strength is knowing yourself, not just going it alone. You know, men are often taught to be strong by keeping things in, by never expressing themselves. But being grounded means knowing your values and asking for help when needed. This is a very masculine trait. If you are drowning, if you are drowning, the masculine thing to do would be to stick it out, to just drown, to not ask for help. If you can't do it by yourself, then you shouldn't be doing it at all, right? You deserve to drown. But that is toxic masculinity. Knowing your own weaknesses is positive masculinity. Being able to say, this is where I can fall short sometimes. How can I get support in order to help me with that? So take the time to reflect on your core values. So you can do this by practicing asking for help in small ways. Normalize support. Especially as guys, you know, we can live in this very isolated bubble. We don't ask help from our friends. We don't talk about challenges that we're going through with our friends or group. Especially in the modern day, male loneliness is a real thing. And there's a reason for that. It's because we're taught that we should just suffer alone and deal with things by ourselves. And oftentimes in relationships, this means that we become these isolated islands where we think, well, I can't talk to my partner about where I need support. I can't talk to my partner about the challenges that I'm having. So I'll just struggle alone. And that builds resentment. So again, positive masculinity is being able to know where you need support and come up with practical steps in order to build that support around you. The third way to practice positive masculinity is to model respect for women actively. This isn't just being nice. This is challenging disrespect when you see it. So as a guy, you may have experienced being around other guys who talk down about women, who label them, who call them psychos, call them nut jobs, overly emotional, whatever it is. We are responsible for building an environment where people see each other equally. So every time we let a sexist joke slide, we end up reinforcing harmful ideas. Because if we're looking to be treated as equals as men, then we need to practice what we're preaching. We also need to treat other people as equals as well. This is positive masculinity. So if people are labeling a group of other people, women, people of other cultures, of other colors, races, creeds, religions, whatever it is, people are talking down about them, being able to challenge that, being able to be assertive about that, and being able to be strong in putting out this idea of equality. If we want to be treated as equals, we need to also treat other people as equals. Whether we disagree with their politics or whatever it is, they're still equal to us. So we need to reinforce this idea. So this can be something as simple as saying, hey, I heard that you were kind of disrespecting your wife a little bit, and I really think that that's not cool. I think that ultimately, whatever way you feel about them, I think that they deserve to be spoken about and treated as an equal, especially if it's your wife, as an example. This way, you're using assertiveness and your masculinity for positivity. You're not being passive and letting things slide. You're calling people out in a respectful way, but you're standing for what you believe in. But if we're going to practice positive masculinity, being able to ask female friends, partners, colleagues, whatever it is, what support looks like for them. Understanding societal gender bias on all fronts, how genders and sexes are treated differently in society is really crucial. Understanding from an outside point of view, women can be treated in a certain way, men can be treated in a certain way, transgender people can be treated in a certain way, gay people, etc. Understanding the biases that exist in society is crucial. And just because one gender is getting treated in a certain way doesn't mean that you don't have gender biases against you. They can coexist at the same time. People have a certain view of men that may not be representative of you as an individual. So it's really crucial to understand all of these biases exist and being able to listen to individual experiences without getting defensive about your own experience. Next, it's really important to reject this lone wolf myth. The truth is that you don't have to go it alone to be strong. This is such a false idea for men to fall into, and it's drummed in movies, in culture, in a lot of society as we've grown up. The idea that men should handle everything by themselves ends up leading to burnout. It leads to shame, and it leads to silence. And oftentimes we can choose to isolate ourselves away from the rest of the world because we feel misunderstood. We feel like we have to just handle things by ourselves, and we're not able to welcome in any support or help. So getting rid of this myth is going to be really crucial, and this will leave you in a stronger position. There is not one man on this planet that is able to isolate themselves 100% and not do things without support from other people. You can't earn money without other people. You can't change the community around you without other people. You can't live in a hut in the middle of the woods, not in contact with anyone forever, because eventually society will still be there and will creep in to this bubble that you exist in. So we need to get away from this lone wolf idea and understand that strength comes from being able to be adaptable to society. That is a very masculine trait, being able to adapt, not isolate. That leaves you in a very powerful position because you're able to overcome challenges in a much more powerful way. Avoiding challenges is an anti-masculine trait, right? If masculinity is about solving a logic, avoiding stuff is not logical. It's actually very emotional because you're saying, I feel uncomfortable, I don't like it, so I'm just going to avoid it. So this lone wolf idea is avoiding the inevitability of other people. So creating a supportive group around yourself, creating a positive masculinity circle or group focused on emotional growth and shared responsibility is a very masculine thing to do. But most of all, as a guy, in order to practice positive masculinity, it's absolutely crucial that we grow emotional literacy. Now, this is something that I work on with a lot of the male members that I work with, is understanding that we can sometimes feel like we are emotionally literate, that we have a high emotional intelligence. But oftentimes what happens is that I see a lot of guys falling into this idea that I don't feel sad, I don't feel angry, and they really struggle to recognize their feelings. This is especially common in ADHD men, which is what we call alexithymia, which is this struggle to identify emotions. And we can fool ourselves into thinking that, well, I know what emotions are. She's mad, she's angry, she's psycho. And this is one thing that, we work on with the members when it comes to relationships, is understanding both your own emotions and your partner's emotions. This, again, is a very positively masculine trait because it allows you to come up with really strong solutions that take into account both of your emotions. And I'll jump into this more in a second, but there's only going to be so much that I can sort of jump in a YouTube video. But if you do want a deeper dive into all of this, especially when it comes to emotions and relationships, then join my relationship bootcamp, where you're going to learn the same fundamental steps that all my members start with to start turning their relationships around. All you have to do is click on the link in the description to grab your spot. So emotional literacy, you can't express what you haven't learned to name. And this really matters when it comes to masculinity. You know, most boys aren't taught to talk about emotions. Beyond mad or fine, there's like no nuance within that. Building emotional vocabulary helps us connect. It helps us to understand ourselves in a much more detailed way. And that is, again, a very masculine trait, is data collection, but also being able to understand others in a very deep way as well. That, again, is a very masculine trait. If we want to overcome problems, then we need to data collect. So this is very, very crucial. And oftentimes us guys do this to a very low standard without even realizing it. And then when it comes to especially male and female relationships, and maybe you've been told this before, as a guy, women can often be like, you have zero emotional intelligence. You are not emotional enough. And as guys, we can feel confused by this, but it's because we haven't developed this emotional vocabulary that is very, very powerful in, you know, repairing relationships. So you can start with this by using things like a feelings wheel to identify your emotions more clearly. Journaling can be helpful to a point. I never recommend it being the only thing, but journaling can be a good entry point to learning more about these feelings. And finally, the most effective way to practice positive masculinity is to understand how to manage conflict. In the thousands of members that I've worked with, I would say 99% of guys have this misunderstanding of how important conflict is in relationships, but also how to effectively fight in a very positive way. I've actually done a deeper dive video, which I'll link to up above. But as men, we can often fight really unfairly. Conflict is so important in relationships, but understanding how to have conflict, especially with positive masculinity, is going to be really crucial. It's important that you don't step away from argument. Oftentimes we can avoid arguments only to have bigger blow-ups later on. So it's crucial that you understand how to be assertive and address the difficult situations, but do it in a very powerful way in order to lead to a stronger solution. So I won't jump into that now. I'll leave you with that deep dive video, and I'll see you over there.